is all not about the Henley Group, it's actually about Stephen's service. Stephen actually, we were just chatting, then he helped me out about two years ago now. I had quite a complicated family visa application that I had to put through. And to be honest, I didn't really know where to start with it, doing it myself. So Stephen helped me out, took away all the kind of stress and hassle from doing it myself. And yeah, I think that's the purpose of today is really for him to take that kind of stress and hassle from you guys sorting out your permanent residency application. So, okay, thanks.
Well, very good morning, everybody. Thanks for turning up to listen to my dulcet tones as I present to you for about 17 minutes on my favourite subject, which is Hong Kong immigration. So, effectively what today's about is to teach you how to go about making an application for permanent residency, really without having to pay for any professional help. As you'll see from my talk, getting the right of abode in Hong Kong is not that difficult. You find that there are problems associated with the amount of time that you spent here and the possibility of some sort of breaks during the 7 years that you need in order to qualify for permanent residency. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about first. It's an analysis of what the right of abode actually is. As you'll discover, it's something less than a right if you are a long-stay foreign national resident that's secured permanent residency by virtue having had 7 years continuous ordinary residency. But I'll talk about how it's something less than a right. I'll take you through the various criteria for qualification, and then we'll look at what the constructs of 7 years continuous ordinary residence actually involves, and specifically look at how time that you may have spent away from Hong Kong could impact on ultimately your eligibility to get the right of abode. You'll see that there is a certain requirement that you are settled in Hong Kong all throughout the time that you've spent the 7 years in Hong Kong, and specifically at the time that you make your application for permanent residency. I'll talk you through the paperwork, what the process looks like, and what you can do if you don't get approved. And then, as I've mentioned right at the very outset, it's less than a right. You can actually lose the right of abode, and then we'll address the question what happens if you've lost the right of abode and what happens to you thereafter. Okay, so this whole presentation hinges on a post that's on the homepage of one of our websites, the HongKongVisaGiza.com blog. If you've seen the HongKongVisaGiza.com website, it's where I post on immigration matters 4 to 5 times a week. But right on the homepage is this post: 10 must-have resources for successful Hong Kong permanent residency application. So as I work my way through the presentation, understand that the information I'm giving you is ultra reinforced, if you will, through all the resources that are contained in this particular piece of content on our websites. Okay, so there are several ways to secure permanent residency in Hong Kong. The mechanism for securing the right of abode lies in the basic law, which is different from other aspects of Hong Kong immigration, which is all really based under the provisions of the Immigration Ordinance and the administrative powers that the Director of Immigration has got to give people dependent visas, to give people investment visas, to give people student visas and the like. The right of abode itself is enshrined in the basic law, and as I say, there are different mechanisms. This talk is delimited to specifically those who are foreign nationals that have been in Hong Kong for a minimum period of 7 years. You can get the right of abode by virtue of Chinese nationality. You can get right of abode by virtue of descent. These are very complex areas, so I'm not going to get into this particular facet of the right of abode. It's purely those that have been here for 7 years living here lawfully. Ultimately, the test for approval is, have you been continuously and ordinarily resident in Hong Kong for a period of not less than 7 years, and any absences from Hong Kong in that time have been of a merely temporary nature, as evidenced by what you leave behind to return back to at the end of each temporary stay abroad. And that's it. That's the entire test. And that test breaks down into various segments. And as we work our way through the presentation, we'll look at the particular segments of that test. And then you'll begin to understand whether or not in your circumstances you will be a shoo-in for an approval or whether you're going to have to work hard for an approval. Okay. Many people ask me, well, what is ordinary residence? Ordinary residence is not a term of art in Hong Kong law. Ordinary residence, as a definition, a legal definition, goes back about 150 years to British case law. And depending on how ordinary residence is construed in the context of how it's supposed to be defined, it can mean different things to different people. For example, ordinary residence under Hong Kong tax law is different from ordinary residence under UK tax law. Ordinary residence under British immigration law is different from ordinary residence under Hong Kong law. But from this House of Lords case from 1921, I think it was, in their natural and ordinary meaning, the words ordinarily resident mean that the person must be habitually and normally resident here, apart from temporary or occasional absences of long or short duration. And the way that the Immigration Department interprets ordinary residence is actually configured squarely within the context of this particular House of Lords test. There are certain conditions that you need to have present in order to get the right of abode approved under that test. The first is that residence requires you to have a residence visa. So it often comes to me, people say, well, look, I arrived here, way back when, and I spent 6 months as a visitor looking for work, and then I finally got a job and I got my first employment visa. So, effectively, I've been here now 7 years, haven't I? And the short answer is no, you haven't. You've been here 6.5 years. Because the clock starts ticking on the 7 years on the date that your first residence visa is activated. It's not the first date that your residence visa was granted to you or when you got your Hong Kong identity card issued to you. It's when you made your first landing under a formal residence visa. And a formal residence visa can be a student visa, it can be a dependent visa, an investment visa, an employment visa, visa issued under the Quality Migrant Admission Scheme or the Capital Investment Entrance Scheme. But it has to be a visa that avails you with formal residency. If you are here as a visitor, that time prior to becoming a resident doesn't count. So the clock starts ticking from the day that you got your first residence visa activated upon first arrival. So clearly, if you're a resident here, you're resident here. But what kind of residence are we really talking about? I'll take you through a scenario that will illustrate this point. So you come to Hong Kong as a visitor, you spend 3 or 4 months looking for a job. You get a job offer. You spend 6 weeks getting your application for an employment visa considered and approved by the Immigration Department. And then you start working under your activated employment visa. You issue your Hong Kong identity card. You work for that employer for 2.5 years, and in the process you go on to get an extension to your first employment visa, and then you decide that you're going to leave your job. And you leave your job, and you're out of work effectively for 3 months, but you've still got a valid residence visa endorsed in your passport. You then make an application to the Immigration Department to change your sponsorship under your employment visa, and you then get that approval, and you carry on working until your current limit to stay expires, and then the Immigration Department give you a 1-year extension. So you're now up to about, say, 4 years of residence in Hong Kong. You spent some time working for your original sponsor, you spent some time with a residence visa but not working for that sponsor, you changed your sponsorship, and then you got an extension, you carried on moving forward. And then you decide you're going to leave at about year 5, you're going to leave that current employer, and you're going to start a business for yourself. And you say you leave your employer about 3 months before your employment visa is due to expire, but it takes you about 6 months to finalize everything that you need to be in a position to make an application to the Immigration Department for an investment visa. So let's say at about 1 month before your current limit to stay under your employment visa is about to expire, you've got a month left, you then make an application to change your visa category from sponsored employment through to business investment, and that application takes 2 months to finalise. So at the point of you putting your application in, you've only got a month left, and then you run out of status because it takes another month for the Immigration Department to finalise your investment visa application. So the question is begged as to, at the point of your current visa expiring but your investment visa not having yet been approved, you go into what I call the twilight zone. And that is where you can't get an extension to your employment visa because the conditions that are relevant for an extension aren't at play in your life because you're no longer working for that prior employer. But the Immigration Department haven't yet finalised your investment visa application, so they haven't said yes to your continuing residence. So what do you do in that meantime, in that 1 year, in that 1 month? That's what I call the twilight zone. The Immigration Department go on subsequently to approve your application for the investment visa, and then you get a 1 year limit of stay, and then at the end of that 1 year you get another 1 year limit of stay, or possibly a 2 year limit of stay, and finally you fall over the line for 7 years. So the question is, in that profile, have you broken your continuity of residence in any way by virtue of the fact that you spent 3 months between jobs but you had a valid residence visa, and a little bit later on in the piece you spent about a month out of residence visa status as the Immigration Department adjusted you from sponsored employment through to business investment? Does any of that break your continuity of ordinary residence under Hong Kong laws as it's practiced? Well, the short answer is no. As long as you've effectively had back-to-back residence visas throughout all of that time, or at any point in that time where you haven't had a valid period of stay manifested in your passport as a residence visa holder, you would be either in the twilight zone or in a state of administrative flux as you move from one visa state to another, and you've got an active application in the system. The Immigration Department don't take any of those scenarios as breaking your continuity of ordinary residence. It's only if you effectively lose a residence visa for any good reason, and then you spend an extended period of time in Hong Kong as a visitor, and normally you get to 3 or 4 months as a visitor and you don't have an active application in the system, the concept of administrative flux begins to wear thin the longer you spend under visitor visa status. And there's no hard and fast rule as to how long that is, but you'd be amazed about how many people misunderstand how immigration is practiced here and feel that because even though they've had their home here and they've had all the circumstances of their lives here, they've been here as visitors as they've adjusted from one set of circumstances to another set of circumstances. That time spent as a visitor can break your continuity of ordinary residence if you don't have an active application in the system and it gets too long to the point where the Immigration Department believe that you have abandoned your settlement by virtue of you having retained visitor status instead of having a formal residence visa. So this is how qualifying residence is perceived by the Immigration Department. Also, a part of the test for approval is that you need to show that you are settled in Hong Kong, both in terms of how your life has been lived whilst you've held your residence visas for those 7 years, and also at the point of where you actually make your declaration that you've taken Hong Kong as your only place of permanent residence at the time that you formally submit your application for the right of abode. And so what the Immigration Department are looking for in terms of settlement are things like, if you're married, where are your family? If you have children, where do they go to school? It's okay for your children not to be educated in Hong Kong, as long as if they're being educated somewhere else, it's clear that Hong Kong is home and that the children have been coming back to home at the time that the school holidays and what have you are in play. The Immigration Department are looking to see that all the vestiges of a normal settled life in Hong Kong are at play. So, you know, have you been filing your tax returns if you've been working? If you've had a business, have you been conducting that business? Is that business in compliance? Is it clear and obvious in all the facts that your life is in Hong Kong and not somewhere else? Even though, as we'll see in the next slide, you can spend a considerable amount of time outside of Hong Kong in pursuit of business and other activities and not break your continuity of ordinary residence. So it's a clear question of fact as to what's going on in your life circumstances, as to whether or not you are settled in Hong Kong. Okay, so part of the approvability test is to say that to show that Hong Kong is your only place of permanent residence. And the only objective way for the Immigration Department to be able to satisfy themselves that you have taken Hong Kong as your only place of permanent residence is to make you put your hand on your heart and effect a declaration on the form ROP 146 that states that you have taken Hong Kong as your only place of permanent residence. And as long as you effectively make this declaration, this aspect of the approvability test is put to bed. Part of the process for approval is to show to the Immigration Department that you're of good character and that you have no outstanding taxation liabilities. So prior to approving your application, the Immigration Department will check with the Inland Revenue Department to see if you've got an unpaid tax bill. If you've got an unpaid tax bill, they won't finalise your application. You'll have to pay a tax bill. And a question that comes up quite often is the question of criminal convictions, both in terms of criminal convictions before you came to Hong Kong and any criminal convictions that have occurred during your time in Hong Kong, and will these impact on your ability to secure the right of abode? As regards criminal convictions you may have had prior to coming to Hong Kong, you basically just have to rely on the fact that if the Immigration Department have approved you for a residence visa in full knowledge of any criminal convictions, then that's not going to impact negatively on your ability to secure the right of abode subsequently. In terms of any criminal convictions that you have after you come to Hong Kong, effectively, because you've been a temporary resident for the first 7 years of your life here, you will have had to go through a visa extension exercise at some point in the wake of having a criminal conviction. And it's how the Immigration Department treats you as regards your extension that drives the question as to how they'll treat you when it comes time for the right of abode. So if they've extended you and you're in the wake of a criminal conviction, you don't have to be concerned that it's going to inhibit you from going on to become a permanent resident subsequently. So criminal convictions in the main tend not to be a problem as long as they're minor criminal convictions, and the Immigration Department previously said yes to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of being absent from Hong Kong as part of this slide here, because the two do work together in a very important way. Remember, the test for approval is continuous ordinary residence for a period of not less than 7 years where any absences from Hong Kong have been of a merely temporary nature, as evidenced by what you leave behind to return back to at the end of each temporary stay abroad. And the Immigration Department are looking for certain kinds of key anchor documents to satisfy themselves as regards your settlement and your continuity of ordinary residence. And the two critical sets of documents are, on the one hand, a continuous collection of filings of tax documents, that is, the returns that you've made to the Inland Revenue Department, either by your employer or you personally, that speak to you having been earning in Hong Kong and filing your taxes each year. Those documents are really important, as is also proof that you have maintained a home in Hong Kong throughout all of that time. And in this regard, you will either have owned property or you'd been renting. And the Immigration Department would hope to see that evidence of both, not least back-to-back tenancy agreements if you've been renting throughout all of that time. Now, the problem is that not everybody keeps accurate records, and 7 years is a long time, and normally in Hong Kong, a tenancy is only going to last for 2 years, and after 3 tenancies, you're fed up with the paperwork anyway, and you throw it away, and you don't give any thought to how this would be important documentation for in the context of an immigration application subsequently. So the key thing is that if you don't have your tenancy agreement, so you haven't done properly through all this time, but you've filed your taxes, then you're kind of going to be okay, because the Immigration Department take the view that you have been laying your head on a pillow in Hong Kong every night. If you've paid your taxes, and they also check to see how much time you spent in Hong Kong throughout all of that time. And if it's clear on all the facts that you've had a residence visa, either as an investment visa or an employment visa, you've been engaged in gainful commercial activity here. If you filed your taxes, you've been obviously interacting with society in a way that's important for settlement purposes. And if they can see that you've spent a large part of your time in Hong Kong, clearly you've been sleeping somewhere here every night. So if you can't come up with a proof of tenancy agreement, that's not such a big problem. The problem is if you've spent a lot of time away from Hong Kong, because quite often you see a situation where you perhaps work for an employer for a couple of years, and the employer says, we want you to go to Singapore for a year, and you're going to have to move and live in Singapore and take your family with you. The question then is begged is, well, will that 1 year in Singapore break your continuity of ordinary residence when it comes time for the right of abode? Well, normally, depending on what you leave behind to return back to, the answer is no, as long as you can show that it was your intention at the time that you departed that you were going to depart on a merely temporary basis only. So the documentation that you deduced to the Immigration Department at that time would be a copy of your correspondence with your employer that was kind of the negotiation leading to your deployment to Hong Kong, and clearly on that evidence that it's the intention of your employer that you're going to go there temporarily, and that they are going to maintain your residence visa status here, because the intention is that you're going to come back to Hong Kong at the end of that temporary stay abroad. So you could, in fact, spend, say, for example, 12 months in those circumstances in Singapore, and still be able to argue to the Immigration Department that you didn't break your continuity of ordinary residence. Another example from our files is a case quite a few years ago now where she was owning a business and he was her dependent. And he had some health problems and he went back to the UK for one of his regular checkups. And when he got to see his doctor, the doctor said, you're this far away from dying, so into hospital you go. So he went into hospital and he had a number of procedures, and time went on. And once he came out of hospital, he effectively couldn't travel. He couldn't get on an aircraft. And this whole scenario played itself out over the course of 2 years. And subsequently, he was able to come back to Hong Kong when his health improved. And then a few months later, we made an application for both of them for the right of abode. So the question was, given that he'd been away all of that time, more than 2 years, had he broken his continuity of ordinary residence for the purposes of his right of abode application? The short answer is no, he hadn't, because he had a dependent visa. His wife was in Hong Kong running the business. At the time that he left, he was just going to go back to the UK for a regular routine checkup. He didn't know what was going to happen to him whilst he was there, and subsequently, as soon as he was able to travel again, he got on an aircraft and flew back. So you could tell in those circumstances that it had been his intention to depart on a merely temporary basis, as evidenced by what he left behind to return back to at the end of that temporary stay abroad, which turned out to be a 2-year lengthy period. So you can have a set of circumstances where you are away from Hong Kong for quite a long time, and as long as you've got the qualifying conditions in place for the right of abode approval purposes, you will be able still to go on to argue successfully that you should be granted permanent residency in Hong Kong. The process takes about 6 to 8 weeks altogether to finalise. You can make your application 30 days before your 7-year anniversary is up, although the Immigration Department won't actually finalise the approval formalities until you've gotten across the 7-year anniversary line, so because it's hard and fast under the basic law. And the way it works is that you make your application to have your eligibility for permanent residency verified, and you submit all the paperwork. You can either do it online or you can submit the application in person on the 25th floor of the Immigration Tower, and then the Immigration Department receive all your documents and they look at it, and if they're satisfied on the evidence that they've got before them and their own investigations as to how your life has been lived in Hong Kong. Very effectively, a permanent resident of Hong Kong, they then invite you in to finalise the procedure. And the finalisation is where you have a so-called interview, and the letter that you get is a little bit misleading because it says, please attend for an interview, and people, their hearts start palpitating, what's going to happen to me? But effectively all that they're doing is they're going to inspect your original travel document for the first time, because you've submitted your paperwork online or in a bundle without any formal inspection of your travel documentation or your Hong Kong identity card. So at the verification appointment, they literally just look at your identity card and they look at you, they look through your passports, and they make sure that you as the applicant is the human being that's going to be granted the status. And if they're satisfied that you are the person in the application, then the immigration officer will then sign in front of you and verify your eligibility for the right of abode. And at that point, you become a permanent resident of Hong Kong. Once you've got your eligibility verified, you can then go down to the 8th floor of Immigration Tower and adjust your Hong Kong identity card from your temporary ID card to a permanent ID card. And if you remember, when you got your temporary ID card issued to you, it was literally a piece of paper, and then a few days later you had to go and collect your smart ID card. Well, when you get your permanent identity card, it's exactly the same process again. You will get a temporary ID card. About 10 days later, you get your permanent smart ID card. And then with your permanent identity card, you just come and go through the borders of Hong Kong using your identity card without needing to present your passport. And once you get the right of abode, you effectively become you get de facto citizenship of Hong Kong, although you can't qualify automatically for HKCR passport, because to get a HKCR passport, you need to take an extra step, which is to relinquish your existing nationality and then qualify independently for Chinese citizenship. And once you've got Chinese citizenship, disavowing yourself of all your existing nationalities, and you're a permanent resident of Hong Kong, then you can get a HKCR passport. So if you're going to maintain your existing nationality whilst you're a permanent resident of Hong Kong, you will not be eligible to apply for a HKCR passport. And as I've mentioned, this right of abode that you get is actually something less than a right, because if you secure the right of abode by virtue of your Chinese citizenship, either through direct acquisition of citizenship or Chinese citizenship by descent, then the right of abode that you get cannot be lost. However, if you are a long-stay foreign national who secure the right of abode using this technique, it can be lost. The way that you maintain your right of abode as a long-stay foreign national resident is to be physically present in Hong Kong on at least one occasion in any 36-month given period. So it means once you've got the right of abode, you can go away, and as long as you come back within one time in any 3-year given period, you'll maintain your right of abode. So it's a very simple right to maintain, but it can be lost. And the idea here, the idea behind this, was to attach your ability to maintain the right of abode to your geographical presence in Hong Kong. And if you are not physically present in Hong Kong on at least one occasion in a 3-year given period, then you will, by operation of law, be automatically downgraded to the right to land. Now, the right of abode actually comes with a number of different rights, including the right not to be removed, the right not to be deported, and you also get the right to land by implication. But if you lose the right of abode and you're downgraded to the right to land, effectively you can be removed and you can be deported from Hong Kong, but when you present yourself in the future, the immigration officer will always have to admit you because you do have the right to land in Hong Kong. And with that right to land are all the attendant privileges associated with formal residence here. So you can join in a business, you can take up employment, any kind of lawful activity without any recourse to the immigration department at all. So in a very practical sense, even if you're downgraded from the right of abode to the right to land, it's not going to have any negative consequences for you. as regards your ability to live and function and work and do all the kind of things that you would normally like to be doing in Hong Kong. So yeah, be aware that you can lose the right of abode, but in that case, the right to land that you get is practically just as good as the right of abode, although it's not going to afford you the ability to participate in taxation advantages or stamp duty advantages by owning property, for example. That's the only reserved for people who are formal permanent residents of Hong Kong. Okay, so what kind of documents do you normally adduce when you're making your application? Well, as I mentioned, the anchor documents are your continuous series of taxation returns and proof that you've either owned a residence here or you've been renting here. If you are unable to fulfill a straightforward sequence of documents in those two areas, then any other documentation that speaks to your lives here. If you've got children in school, copies of the children's school reports, for example, throughout the 7 years. If you've held a bank account here with Hong Kong addresses throughout all this time, copies of your bank statements. Effectively, what you need to do is you've got to say to yourself, right, I've definitely been here 7 years and I'm going to pass this test, but you know, I'm a bit shy on my taxation documents. I'm a bit shy on my residence documents. What else have I got that clearly speaks to the reality that I've been ordinarily resident in Hong Kong? So do an analysis of your life and look to see what you can lay your hands on. And then normally you can put together a mosaic or a patchwork of documents that actually support the idea that you have been continuously and ordinarily resident here. Okay. So that's it. Everything that you need is on the website, and anything that I haven't touched upon, you're most welcome to ask me questions about now, if you wish. Thanks.